نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إنما يوفى الصابرون أجرهم بغير حساب صدق الله العظيم صلى الله على النبي الأمي وآله صلى الله عليه وسلم صلاة وسلام عليك يا Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. All praise is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our cherisher and our sustainer, and choices of durood and salam be upon his beloved, our master, arwahuna fida, Sayyidina Muhammadur Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. The month of Ramadan al-Mubarak is a month in which generally Muslims increase in charity. They increase in giving. They increase in giving sadaqat, in being generous. And this is the sunnah of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Huzur alayhi salam, he was the most generous in the entire creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But when it came to the blessed month of Ramadan, then that generosity would increase even further. As Allah says, Vah kya jood karam hai, shahibat ha tera, nahi sunta hi nahi mangne wala tera. This was the attribute of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that he used to be so generous, but when it came to the blessed month of Ramadan, then that generosity would reach another peak, would reach another level that was not seen during the rest of the year. And we need to inculcate in ourselves the jazba and the sunnah of being generous, of giving, of thinking of our fellow Muslim brothers and sisters above ourselves. And this is the jazba we need to inculcate in ourselves. Remember, when a person gives in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his wealth does not decrease. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised that a person who gives in the path of Allah, his wealth will increase manyfold. And how manyfold? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, مَثَلُ الَّذِينَ يُنْفِقُونَ أَمْوَالَهُمْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ كَمَثَلِ حَبَّةٍ أَنْبَتَتْ سَبْعَ سَنَابِلَ فِي كُلِّ سُنْبُلَةٍ مِئَةُ حَبَّةٍ وَاللَّهُ يُضَاعِفُ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ وَاللَّهُ وَاسِعٌ عَلِيمٌ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the example of those who spend their wealth in the way of Allah is similar to that of a grain which has grown 7 stalks, and in each stalk contains 100 grains. And all Allah may multiply, and Allah may multiply it for whomsoever He pleases. And Allah is all-encompassing, all-knowing. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives an analogy in the Holy Quran to make us understand how much reward He gives for a person who spends in His path. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives the example, the analogy of 1 grain. So if you give 1 grain in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is as if that 1 grain you have sowed it into the ground, and from that 1 seed, 7 stalks has come out. So a plant, a seedling comes out from that, and from that seedling, there are 7 stalks that come out from that. And on each stalk, there's 100 grains. So that gives you a total of how many? 700. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us an analogy in the Holy Quran to make us understand, if you give 1 grain in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with sincerity, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you in return 700 grains. Subhanallah. And not just 700, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills, He can give you even more than that. Depending obviously on the time, depending on the place where it is given, depending on the sincerity with which it is given. For example, if you look at time, if sadaqah is given during the month of Ramadan, then obviously the reward for that is much greater than when you give sadaqah in other months. So like this, even in Makkatul Mukarramah, Madinatul Munawwara, if you have to give sadaqat, then because of the place, your reward increases in comparison to you sitting here and giving sadaqat from your home. So these are various factors that influence how much Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills to give you reward for your sadaqah. But in general, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains to us, if you give 1 grain, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you 700 grains in return, or even more than that, if He pleases. Now, Rasulullah Sallallahu, Alaihi Wasallam, He is the greatest manifestation of the mercy and the compassion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now this is such a glad tidings for us, for the Ummah of Huzur alayhi salam, that we get so much of reward for giving 1 grain in the path of Allah. But Huzur alayhi salam is so merciful towards his Ummah, he is so compassionate towards his Ummah, that when this verse was revealed, Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he made a dua in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he said, Rabbi zid ummati. O Allah, increase the reward of this for my ummah even more. Imagine us giving 1 and receiving 700 in return is already such a great mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But Huzur alayhi salam makes dua for us, and he says, Rabbi zid ummati. O Allah, increase this even further for my ummah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He always does what pleases His beloved Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the verse, Man zal ladhi yuqridu Allah qardan hasanan fayudha'ifahu lahu ad'afan kathira. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Huzur alayhi salam the glad tidings to his dua and said, is there someone who will loan to Allah a good loan, so that Allah may increase for him even many more times? Subhanallah. Already Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us 700 times the reward, and Huzur alayhi salam makes dua, increase it more for my ummah. So now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, is there anyone who will give a loan to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can give you many more times more than what you have given? And it is beyond our understanding how much many more times entails. That's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will. And when this verse was revealed, this is the compassion, this is the mercy of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that again Huzur alayhi salam said, Rabbi zid ummati. O Allah, increase the reward of this even further for my ummah. Subhanallah. Even after this verse being revealed, that so much of reward we will be getting over and above the 700, Huzur alayhi salam again, because of his love and his mercy for his ummah, he again asked the same dua, O Allah, increase it further for my ummah. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals the verse, إِنَّمَا يُوَفَّ الصَّابِرُونَ أَجْرَهُمْ بِغَيْرِ حِسَابٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then says, only the patient ones will be fully given their reward without measure. Subhanallah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then pleases His beloved Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam by saying that those who are patient, those who give in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and those who are patient, they will be given reward without measure. Subhanallah. So first it was 700 times. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, many more times you will get over and above that. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to please His beloved Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, says that they will be rewarded without measure. So only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows how much a person will get rewarded for his sadaqat, for his charity, for his good works, if it is done sincerely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam mentioned in the hadith, that if a person with a sincere heart, he gives 1 luqma, 1 morsel, he gives in charity to someone, with absolute sincerity, only for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Huzur alayhi salam says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes that charity of his in His daste qudrat, in His hand of power, in His hand of mercy. Now we should not imagine the hand of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as we have hands, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from any form. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even mentioned the Holy Quran, referring to His daste qudrat, His hand of power. But that does not mean that there's any similitude between the hand of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the hand as we understand it to be. So Huzur alayhi salam says that you give one morsel with a sincere heart for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes that in His hand of mercy and He then nurtures it until such time that on the day of judgment you will see a mountain in return for that one morsel that you had given. Subhanallah. Look at how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses us for giving in His path. Why? Because we are the ummatis of Rasoolullah Sallallahu ta'ala Alaihi Wasallam. Imagine giving one morsel. You know, every day we eat at iftar. Today when you're having iftar and you have one morsel, just imagine that this one morsel, if you had to give to someone, on the day of judgment, there would be a mountain of reward in return for that one morsel. Subhanallah. So imagine if we have to give in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without counting, without, looking at how much we are giving. Imagine how much Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give us in return. And this is why it is so important for us to follow the example of the Sahaba-i-Ikram, how they understood generosity from Rasulullah Sallallahu ta'ala Alaihi Wasallam. And then you will see the fruits of those charities in your own life. Sayyidah Aisha Siddiqa radiyallahu ta'ala anha, once she was fasting, and the only thing she had in her home to break a fast with was one roti, one round flat bread, one roti, that's all she had. And during the afternoon, someone came and they knocked on the door, and there was a man who was begging, and he said, please give me something for the sake of Allah. So Sayyidah Aisha Siddiqa radiyallahu ta'ala anha, she said to her servant, what is there that we can offer to this person? So the servant said, we only have one roti with which you can break your fast. There's nothing else in the house. So Sayyidah Aisha Siddiqa says, it's fine, give that bread to him. The servant says, but you won't have anything to break your fast with. She says, it's fine, give the bread. So the servant gives that one roti to the person who was begging. Sometime later, that same afternoon, just before iftar, someone comes and knocks on the door. When the servant opens, it was someone who brought a gift of meat, goat meat covered in cloth for Sayyidah Aisha Siddiqa radiyallahu ta'ala anha. Subhanallah. So she takes that and she says to the servant, eat from this, this is better than that bread that you had. Subhanallah. Why? This was their yaqeen, this was their faith and certainty that if they give in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that which they have will never decrease. They will always get better than what they had. They will always get more than what they had. This is why Sayyidina Mawla Ali radiyallahu ta'ala, he says that if you obtain wealth, then you must give some part of that wealth in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as your wealth will not decrease by giving. And he says, even if your wealth becomes less, apparently, Sayyidina Mawla Ali radiyallahu ta'ala says, even then you must give, because wealth was never meant to be with you in the first place. Subhanallah. And the reason he says this, that even if it had to get less, for us to understand, because when we have wealth, if I have 1,000 rand and I give 500 rand in charity, what do I have left? I have 500 rand left. Now if I look at it logically, I will say to myself, but my wealth has decreased, because I had 1,000, now after giving I only have 500 left. But when it comes to yaqeen, when it comes to certainty, and when it comes to iman in Allah and His Rasul Sallallahu ta'ala Alaihi Wasallam, then we must not look at things logically. Then we must not look at the numbers. Don't look at what is apparent in front of you. Look at what the Holy Quran says, look at what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and look at what Rasulullah Sallallahu ta'ala Alaihi Wasallam said, that if you give in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will get much more than what you gave. And this must be our yaqeen, that maybe temporarily I might have 500 rand left, but undoubtedly I'm going to get more than what I gave. And this was the aqidah of the Sahaba-i-Ikram. This is how they learned generosity from Rasulullah Sallallahu ta'ala Alaihi Wasallam. This is why they gave without counting. They didn't care, even if it was the last thing in their home, they knew, if I give sincerely for the sake of Allah, I will get in return. I will not go hungry. This was their certainty. Sayyidina Uthman Ghani radiyallahu ta'ala, that Sahabi who was well known for his generosity. during the time of the Khilafat of Sayyidina Siddiq Akbar radiyallahu ta'ala an, a person comes walking from Syria. He comes all the way to Madinatul Munawwara. And he comes to Sayyidina Siddiq Akbar radiyallahu ta'ala and he says, "Oh Amirul Mu'mineen." He makes salam and he says, "Oh Amirul Mu'mineen, I'm coming from Syria. I own a business there in a certain village. And due to some difficulties in my business, I have gone into a huge debt. And I have come to you seeking assistance, seeking help, to please fulfill my debt for me." So Sayyidina Siddiq Akbar radiyallahu ta'ala an, he was Amirul Mu'mineen, but look at the way he used to live. You know, today we have people that are leaders in the world, and they live lives of luxury while the people under them live in poverty. This was not the way of Rasoolullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and the Sahaba Ikram. Sayyidina Siddiq Akbar radiyallahu ta'ala, being Amirul Mu'mineen, the Khalifa of the time after Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he takes this person into his home, and this person sees that this Sayyidina Siddiq Akbar does not even have a bed in his house. He has a few torn leaves of a palm tree on which he was sleeping. And he says, "Can I say something to you? It's been 3 days I have not even eaten grain." Allahu Akbar. He says, "I'm just going by in the last few days just by having dates." This was his condition. He was Amirul Mu'mineen. He says, "Look, my condition is such that I unfortunately cannot help you. But I tell you what, go to Hazrat Uthman Ghani and he will sort you out." So this person says to Hazrat Sayyidina Siddiq Akbar radiyallahu ta'ala, he says, "But I need a lot of money." He didn't say how much, but he says, "I need a lot to fulfill my debt." So Sayyidina Siddiq Akbar radiyallahu ta'ala says to him, "Where your thinking ends, that is where the generosity of Sayyidina Uthman Ghani begins." Subhanallah. Where your imagination about generosity ends, that is where the generosity of Uthman begins. He says, "Go to him, he will sort you out." He says, "Okay, must I tell him that you sent me?" He says, "No, you don't have to tell him anything. Just tell him that you are a Muslim and you are the ghulam of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. That's all you need to say." So he says, "Fine." So he goes, eventually finds the home of Sayyidina Uthman Ghani radiyallahu ta'ala an, and he knocks on the door. When he knocks on the door, Sayyidina Uthman Ghani was busy scolding his children. And he says to his children, "Why are you people having honey and milk? What is the need to be so extravagant? Why don't you just have milk or just have honey? Why must you have two sweet things? Milk is sweet, honey is sweet. Why are you increasing the expenses like that?" So this person is hearing this from the outside, and he thinks to himself in his mind, he says, Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq said a lot about this person's generosity. Here he is scolding his children for having two sweet things, for having honey and milk. How is he going to sort my problem out? This was what he was thinking in his mind. Anyway, after a few minutes, Sayyidina Uthman Ghani, he opens the door. He makes salam, this person makes salam. Sayyidina Uthman Ghani understood he was Muslim. Sayyidina Uthman Ghani, he replies to his salam, and he says, "I was saying something to my children, I was making them understand something, and because of which you had to wait a few minutes. Please make me maaf. I apologize." Look at his humility. Such a great Sahabi, but the first thing he does is, because he was just a few minutes late in opening the door for this person, he doesn't know who he is. But first thing he does is, after replying to the salam, he apologizes. He says, "Please make me maaf that I'd made you wait for a few minutes." He brings him inside, and the first thing Sayyidina Uthman Ghani presents him with is milk with honey in it. Now this person, he's thinking in his mind, wow, just now he was scolding his children for having milk with honey in it. Now the first thing he presents to me is milk with honey in it. It's an ajib person, it's a strange person this. He doesn't know who Uthman Ghani radiyallahu ta'ala is. First time he's meeting him. So now he has all of these thoughts in his mind. After having the milk with the honey, Sayyidina Uthman Ghani brings halwa for him. Now he thinks in his mind, there he was scolding his children, telling them they must have one sweet thing. Here he's giving me three sweet things. Now he's even more confused. What a strange man this is. Eventually, after he was satisfied, his hunger was satisfied, then Sayyidina Uthman Ghani says to him, so tell me, what brings you here? So then he explains that he's from Syria. He came because of his business dealings. He went into debt. And he says to Sayyidina Uthman Ghani, I need some money to fulfill my debt. He did not say how much. He narrates himself. He says, I did not say to Sayyidina Uthman Ghani how much I need. I just said to him, I need some money to fulfill my debt. He says, next thing, Sayyidina Uthman Ghani calls out to one of his servants. And the servant comes and brings a camel, which is fully laden with clothes, with food, with money. And Sayyidina Uthman Ghani says to him, that here, take this. On this camel, there is food for you and your family. There is clothes for you and your family. And there is 6,000 gold coins here. 6,000 ashrafis. All this person said, I need some money to fulfill my debt. And Sayyidina Uthman Ghani brings a camel fully laden with so much of stuff. And this person says, I said to him, I need some money, but in actual fact, I needed 3,000 gold coins to sort everything out with my business. I did not even say to Sayyidina Uthman Ghani how much I need, but he gave me double what I actually needed. 6,000 gold coins he gave me. Plus all of this food and this clothes, everything for my family. So he says to Sayyidina Uthman Ghani, but this camel, how am I going to return this camel all the way back from Syria? So Sayyidina Uthman Ghani says, I did not give you the camel for you to return. That's also part of the gift. Take that also. Subhanallah. This was the generosity of Sayyidina Uthman Ghani radiyallahu ta'ala an. So this person, he starts to cry, he has tears in his eyes. And he says to Sayyidina Uthman Ghani, Huzur, I'm a bit confused. When I came, I was standing outside your door, and I heard you scolding your children for having two sweet things. You were scolding them for having honey and milk. But here, when I look at your generosity, I'm confused. So Sayyidina Uthman Ghani radiyallahu ta'ala replies to him with something that we need to embed in our hearts. Sayyidina Uthman Ghani says to him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not bless me with wealth so that my children can walk around in luxury. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed me with wealth so that I can serve the Ummah of Rasoolullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. This was his mindset. To serve the Ummah of Rasoolullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. This is why when it came to serving the Ummatis of Huzur alayhi salam, he used to give without counting. He did not care how much he used to give. Why? Because he gave for the pleasure of Allah and His Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And this is what we need to inculcate in ourselves. If we are blessed with wealth from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes, we have every right to enjoy, but we must not become over extravagant. We must take the medium path in everything. Why? Because that wealth hasn't been given to us just to drown ourselves in luxury. That wealth has been given to us to serve the Ummah of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant all of us the tawfiq and the hidayat to open our hearts and to give generously for the sake of Allah and His Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and to have the certainty of the reward which Allah and His Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam has promised us. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المؤمنين والمؤمنات إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. جزاكم الله.